Good morning, everyone. Hi, I guess we can go ahead and get started. I don't know how everybody else wasn't dancing. That music just gets me going, particularly in the morning. I love it. I love it. Welcome. My name is Heidi Wagner. I'm actually Senior Vice President of Global Government Affairs for a company called Elevate Bio. For purposes of this webinar, though, I'm a very proud board member of No Patient Left Behind. And for those of you who aren't fully sure, No Patient Left Behind is a not-for-profit organization that is primarily drug developers, such as companies like my own, that are very committed to patient engagement and putting the patient first in our activities, whether that's in our clinical trial design or just in terms of being transparent in our engagement with patients. So I'm very, very excited to welcome you all today to talk about this very important topic. We had a few questions up on the screen that were meant to be thought-provoking, and I'd love for you all to, obviously, you were thinking about your answers, but I'd really like for you to kind of put your preconceived notions, park them at the door, so to speak, so we can really talk about how the FDA and clinical trials and just really some opportunities for modernization that we would like to discuss. So kind of hearkening back to Aretha, before we get started, I want to make sure that we pay some respect to science and then also really to the folks that we have on the webinar today that represent the patient community. They're the true heroes. We have an incredibly ambitious agenda today, so apologies in advance if we're kind of rushing a few things because we have some great speakers to present and also just a lot of really important topics to go over. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This is being recorded, just for those of you who know that way people can actually tune in later if they need to. And there's also the little hand raising for the Q&A button. So I think if people could actually flag that chat function, or not flag, use the chat function if you have questions, that would be helpful. Thanks. Okay, so with that, I get to introduce all of our speakers. So we are very, very lucky today to have a moderator with us, Victoria Knight. Victoria is a freelance healthcare reporter based in Washington, D.C., which is where I am. She's previously worked for Axios and KFF Health News, covering policy issues in Congress, the federal agencies, and the presidential administrations. She's an alumni of the University of Tennessee and the University of Georgia, so I don't know how you sort out your football allegiance with those.
It was a rough weekend.
I bet it was. That's incredible. So thank you for joining us, Victoria. The panelists we have, and they're part of our Patient Advocacy Action Committee for MPLB. First, we have Michael Kramer. Michael is a 23-year-old cancer survivor and social media creator who beat the odds after being diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of lymphoma. He's currently participating in a clinical trial for graft versus host disease, a serious complication from his treatment. Alongside his mom, Ashley, the lovely Ashley, he co-hosts Michael and Mom Talk Cancer, a podcast and blog that blends raw honesty, humor, and hope for patients and caregivers alike. Ashley, his mother, is a caregiver, educator, and advocate who supported both her late husband and son through cancer. Talk about heroes. She shares the benefit of her experience leading caregiver support groups and writing about their experiences to help guide others. Thank you both for joining.
Thank you. We are so honored to be here.
Next, we have Valerie Trainum. Valerie is a passionate breast cancer and multiple myeloma advocate focused on education and health equity in the African American community. She collaborates across organizations to empower patients and spotlight disparities in care. This is a very, very important topic that we're all really focused on right now. Welcome, Valerie. Amy Cohen. Amy is a sickle cell advocate and patient trust expert. I love that. I think it's a really important part of your title. She brings both lived experience and professional expertise to today's conversation. As the founder of The Patient Room, Amy partners with pharma and biotech firms to transform patient recruitment and engagement, building authentic, trust-centered relationships, and ensuring that the patient voice is truly at the center of research, care, and impact. Welcome, Amy. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Victoria to get things started.
Hey everyone, I'm Victoria. Excited to be here today with you all. With that, thank you, Heidi, for the great intros. We're going to dive into clinical trials 101. So what every patient should know about clinical trials. The purpose is to kind of demystify the clinical trial process, make sure everyone kind of understands what it really looks like in real life. And so we have some great voices to highlight that today. So just to start out, inventing new medicines is a long climb. It is, expensive, complex, but also it's a really human process. And this is a kind of interesting stat I didn't know. 80% of trials face delays or early termination due to recruitment challenges. So behind all of this data that we see on new medicines and new treatments are people that took these first. So we're going to hear about that today. Let's break down clinical trials in human terms, what actually happens, who runs them, who makes the key decisions, and where the patients fit in. So let's start with Amy. Can you walk us through it and how you explain it to people who may have no familiarity with this process at all? Really start in the simple terms.
Absolutely. So let's think of the journey of a new treatment like the journey of a relationship. So you know what I mean. So everyone's tuned in, analyzing the first dates and wondering, is this the real deal? So it's really no different with a clinical trial. Both a new treatment and a new relationship require trust, plenty of testing, and honestly, a leap of faith. So there's excitement, there's uncertainty, and just like dating, sometimes it feels like everyone's watching to see if it works out in the end. So now in the world of clinical research, there are 4 phases to every clinical trial. So here's how those play out in quote unquote relationship terms. So phase 1, the first date. You're cautiously optimistic. You meet in the cafe and you ask yourself, do I like them? Do I feel safe here? And are they the kind and respectful person that I could move forward with? And you're also checking for any weird vibes as well as red flags. So phase 1 is about safety and first impressions, as well as figuring out the right rhythm and dosage. So next we move on to phase 2, the early relationship stage. So you had a few great dates and you have butterflies. And when you think about them, you wonder, is this going somewhere? Do we have the right chemistry? And can I actually count on this person? In phase 2, you're testing chemistry and consistency, still watching for side effects and red flags. So then we move on to phase 3, where things get serious. You've met their friends and family and you've seen them under stress. You ask yourself, can I build a future with them? So phase 3 is where you compare the treatment to your current standard and test to make sure that your relationship, quote unquote, works in broader settings. So once phase 3 is complete, if the results look promising, the researchers submit a proposal to the FDA for approval. So this is the moment when the leap from testing to public trust begins. And finally, we have phase 4. So that's the long-term commitment phase. So you might move in, you might have gotten engaged or married, and you're in a commitment. So you're navigating holidays, family dynamics, and mundane tasks like grocery lists and laundry. You ask yourself, are they still showing up for me? So we can adapt and grow together. So in phase 4, it's essentially even after the treatment gets FDA approval and is on the shelves of your local pharmacy, it's still monitored very closely. So researchers are continuing to learn, they're tracking new indications as well as long-term effects, as well as recording the real-world data. So it's about being vigilant, constantly monitoring, evolving, expanding, and making sure the relationship holds up over time. All right. So next we have our players, our 6 degrees of separation. So when most people picture clinical trials, they usually imagine a straightforward process. There's a sponsor on one end and a patient on the other end, with information moving directly between them. In reality, it feels much more like a relay race. The baton, which represents all the information, intentions, and reasoning behind each step, is passed through many hands before it ever reaches the patient. So let's walk through the players. So first, you have the participant, the heart the trial. Your health, your lived experience, and willingness to take part in what makes research possible. If there is no patients, there's no trial. Then there's the hospital personnel. We have our nurses, our pharmacists, and administrative staff. These team members may not appear in an official diagram, but they are essential. They greet patients, they draw blood, explain paperwork, and track down test results. Speaking as both the sickle cell patient and one who's worked on trial teams, I know how much these small moments matter. Research nurses notice when patients are worn out, and team members go the extra mile to make sure the process feels truly human, combining compassion with care at every step. So next is the investigator, which is typically a doctor who acts like a referee. This person interprets a protocol, answers questions, and makes real-time decisions about patient care. Then you have the site management organizations, or an SMO. Their job is to make sure those high-level plans fit what the local hospital and clinics can actually do, because everyone has different capabilities. They help translate ideas onto paper into everyday routines that make sense in real settings. And after that comes the contract research organization, or CRO. They put the protocol into action, hire staff, set up systems, and handle all the logistics that most people will never see. And finally, we have our sponsor, usually a pharmaceutical or biotech company. They design the protocols, set the rules, and fund the research. And that is where things start. But it's also where the responsibility for strategy and regulation oversight rests. So by the time the clinical trial involves a patient, it has gone through many hands. Each additional step and each new person involved can create risk. So there can be confusion, delays, or a sense of disconnect. Complexity is a part of the system for a reason, but it should never stand in the way for real communication or connection. So if we want clinical trials to be centered on patients, we must get better at communicating across every level. So even just making these layers more transparent can make a real difference. No patient should be left wondering who to call or who actually understands their care from the beginning to end. And every patient deserves to feel like they're the reason this process exists. That's exactly where patient-focused drug development becomes essential. It's a recalibration, a way to bring patient voice upstream before the protocol is locked, before handoff begins. Because every degree of separation is a degree of potential disconnect, and listening to patients early and often helps close the gap before it even widens.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy, for that great, helpful overview. So we're gonna now hear from Michael. We kind of want to hear from you. What's one thing you wish every patient knew before considering a clinical trial? Let's hear your experience.
Yeah, so I've actually been in a clinical trial for my GVHD for a few months now. And I think some very important things to know before enrolling are about informed consent, placebo, and the length of the trial. Informed consent matters because it is your right to ask questions to make an informed decision. For example, what if my port fails like it did recently and I have to miss a few weeks of treatment, which was not very fun? And I just missed a few weeks of treatment. So will I be kicked out of the trial? Can I leave the trial? So don't be afraid to ask questions, and very specific ones, because trials are very specific and detailed. You deserve to know everything about the trial before you sign up for it, and some trials have very hefty amounts of daily diaries and paperwork, which can be very overwhelming and stressful. And shout out to my mom for doing most of the paperwork for me.
Thank you.
She's helped so much. Also, the placebo effect. I thankfully don't have a placebo in my trial, but a placebo is basically a group of people in a trial who don't get the active treatment. And that is very scary. And it's something I definitely recommend talking to your doctor about and looking into. Also, asking about the length of the trial is very important because you have to dedicate a lot of time to this trial, and it tends to be scheduled very strictly. So knowing your timeline and the length of the treatment journey is very important.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think we're gonna go over to Heidi now to talk more about trial design.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. I think the conversation that both Amy and Michael and Ashley just present.
Well, Ashley didn't yet, but I will.
Okay, yeah, Ashley's still to come, but we all, we got you, Ashley. But I think that those issues at least highlight a lot of what it is we really want to discuss today. I think that, a lot of folks approach clinical trials from a patient perspective as though it's kind of a Hail Mary. This is the only thing I can do, for whatever experience I'm going through. And what we've really learned over the many years I've been a part of this industry on the sponsor side is that, in fact, the closer we are with the patient, the better our trials are, the more likely they are going to be providing the kind of data that the agency wants. And, I do believe there probably was a time when the patient voice was not considered nearly as important as I believe it is considered now. So when we think about modernizing trial design, I think about exactly the things that Michael was just talking about. It's making sure that there's a lot more engagement from the patient community, both at the FDA level, which is a big deal because the FDA needs to understand more about the disease and some of the bigger picture issues that are facing the patient community and some of the challenges that could be presented in a clinical trial setting. But also the patient needs to be very actively involved with the sponsor to do exactly the kinds of things that Michael was just talking about, to really inform the sponsor when it's actually starting to map out what the clinical trial should look like, what kind of endpoints do we need, what's practical for the patient, right? So like how can we minimize the number of disruptions? How can we make it easier for the patient, but also make sure that patients don't have to jump off and get out of the trial, because that ends up obviously negatively impacting the overall experience. So there's on the slide, there's some examples of things that have been done to make sure that the agency, the kinds of opportunities there are for patients to actually get more actively involved and that their voice be heard more clearly. And I think this just is really important because it highlights what I have seen, even the shift in my career, which has been 30 plus years now, really more of a partnership between the patients, the industry, and the agency, the FDA. So obviously we do what we do because we want patients to have therapies, but it needs to be really driven by what exactly those patients' limitations could be and expectations are. I think with informed consent too, I mean, that's obviously a very, very important, and I know I've got to make sure I keep things on track here, but that's really critical. And I think what Michael said about not being shy about saying the kinds of things that are important to you is so, so critical, because if you don't express it, people may just make assumptions and may not truly understand. And I do think that, we're going to kind of talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. There are potentially ways also for AI to start helping maybe sift through some of the complexities of the informed consent. But again, early in my career, this view that informed consent was very rigid. I think there's definitely been more of an understanding that really needs to be an informed conversation, and then the consent can come when things have really been worked out in terms of expectations. Yeah, I don't know, Victoria, do you want to see if there are any questions, or you want to just keep moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I know we're going through a lot of information, so I don't know if people have questions yet, or they want to kind of wait.
We've got some good chats going in the chat room, which is good.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll move on, and then we'll try to have time for questions at the end. But okay, so let's hear from Ashley now. We heard from Michael. Let's hear from Ashley. Same thing, same question to you, except from the parent and caregiver perspective. What's one thing you wish every parent or caregiver knew before considering a clinical trial? And I know you've experienced this from different levels, in your family. So I'd love to hear your view.
Thank you. So yeah, first, Heidi, I'm going to echo you. I feel like I have spent many times reminding caregivers that they approach clinical trials with a lot of fear And
Mhm.
they really do, yeah, right. And a lot of people think, oh my God, a clinical trial, that means that it is the last ditch effort or it's a Hail Mary. But we have experienced that lots of times, many times it's a great option. It doesn't mean your loved one is like at the end of the line and this is the last ditch effort. And that also, I think people think, oh my gosh, my loved one is now like an experiment. But right. But what
Mhm.
Michael said, knowing what you're getting into, it really is important. And I'm just going to say this, and I don't usually talk about this, but compensation and caregiver time. So
Yeah.
I know this is not the first thing we think about when we are discussing a clinical trial, but this is important. So I had to leave my job to be with Michael, to be with my son for chemo radiation when he had his bone marrow transplant. And I really thought within a few months that I would be, back to work. That was in 2020. And then, as he said, he has something called graft versus host disease that hit him very hard after his transplant. So we spent like the next few years literally in the hospital and not really being able to work. And then things were finally getting a little bit better, like I would say the end of last year, beginning of January. And then this year in March, he had a flare up. And actually, for us, it was like the perfect time because this trial that he's in now had just become available. And we jumped at the opportunity. But then, of course, the second part hit me that again, we would be in the hospital all the time and not
Mhm.
in the hospital, but like there's the side effects. There's the extra appointments. There is, as Michael mentioned, the documentation. He needed surgery for a new port, and that was like 3 to 4 weeks of healing and recovery. And his new treatment right now on the trial, twice a week in the hospital, plus other follow-up appointments. And I'm just going to say this for everyone. I'm not just with him because I'm his mom and I don't want to let him go. Like I'm scared. It's because caregivers, all caregivers, you're important. You need documentation. You need someone to drive. You need a second set of ears. You need someone to take notes. You need that invaluable support. So I think we are necessary. And so your participation, caregivers, and your contributions to science are valuable. My mantra has always been the best way to help yourself is help others. But when we help someone else, we feel a better sense of purpose and well-being. And if you're in a clinical trial, of course, you're helping all these people, but that does not mean you shouldn't recognize your own time and energy, and your presence is valuable because this is time away from the rest of the family. This is time away from work. This is time away from like obligations. And of course, you're contributing to science. And yes, he's getting a potentially life-saving or life-changing treatment, but you're also rearranging everything in your life to show up and be there. So I think that deserves acknowledgement, and compensation is not charity. It is about respect. Thank you very much, Aretha Franklin, even though Michael didn't know the song. Oh my God. I was like, what? Anyway,
He doesn't know this song.
I know I'm a terrible mom. He knows a lot of really good music, but he didn't know Aretha, and I'm shocked. Anyway, I'm pretty sure the scientists and researchers are getting paid. So
Yes.
putting that in your ear. So you also deserve like at least a little bit of respect for your time and your giving. I'm not talking, bills don't
Yes.
pause. And I know this firsthand. And we have had to accept help from friends and family. And sometimes it's hard. And recently, and this is another discussion, sorry, Peter, I'm not going to go into it, but Michael did lose his Medicaid recently. So the time you can't work, gas, childcare, food, caregiver support, whatever it is, groceries you can't do, household obligations, it stacks up. And it's everyday stuff and we're lucky because where Michael's treated, the parking, they cover it, they validate it. But of course, I'm going to tip the valet, right? And
Yeah.
there 3 times a week. So, and the little things, they add up. So I would just say to caregivers, ask your doctor, your hospital, your sponsor, the trial navigator, what do I qualify for? Not just the travel and meals, but sometimes there are stipends for your time.
Yeah.
So support for having that very necessary caregiver there during the trial to help document, drive, support, schedule, communicate. We are vital because when we ease the burden for the patient, I think we ease the burden for the care team. So we need to kind of normalize asking for support. We're not asking for a favor. We're normalizing asking and expecting support because it's true, participating in research, it's not just a medical decision, it's like a life decision.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think these are really, really important issues that are starting to get a little bit more attention also from the patient community, but also from policymakers, which is vital. And what you're saying for me having been on the sponsor side, just really highlights you guys are the stars of what it is we're doing. And I do think that, yes, while you're hoping to have something that is actually helpful to Michael, you are contributing to science writ large, and you're doing a public benefit. And so I agree that there needs to be more attention paid to that. Let's just look a little bit about the difference between kind of what fair compensation looks like. And we've got a couple different things. You mentioned stipends, which is one thing. And then there's also getting some of your expenses reimbursed. Now, there are limits on what a drug company can do. You guys can all appreciate that, were we to pay big money to have somebody in the trial, that could provide the optic of something not quite right. And so could create questions about the validity of the trial and of the data. But that's not what we're talking about. We're really talking about the table stakes that you mentioned, Ashley, the basic things that you, and the not so basic things that the costs that you incur on a daily basis, just to make sure that Michael is compliant within what the sponsor needs. There is right now the reality that, unfortunately, clinical trial payments are often considered, or they are considered by the IRS as taxable income, which is outrageous. So we are actually working with the patient community to get a law passed that would no longer see that as taxable income, which I think would be at least a good first step toward recognizing this. But this is the kind of conversation, again, as Michael noted, that you can have and should have, as did Ashley, with the clinical trial sponsor. What are they going to reimburse? What's reasonable? Try and think ahead of what costs you're going to reasonably incur, even if it is like a tip situation. What is it that you would do on a normal basis, and help have that conversation with the sponsor to see what is and is not doable. I think transparency in this case is vital, and it is what is most important. But listen, there's never a time when, science can't advance without patients in the clinical trials. If there were a time that we could actually, if we could study drugs without actual patient involvement, we would, but we can't. And so really strengthening that partnership and that demand for transparency on the part of the patients and their caregivers is critical. On another note, just Ashley, there's all kinds of things that we also advocate that be taken into consideration in terms of the caregiver involvement. And that's a topic for another day, but just what does a payer look at and the kind of savings that they would derive by paying for a new therapy? Letting Ashley go back to work is a pretty significant thing, right? And so those kinds of things we're also advocating in another way, webinar for another time, but just to show the breadth of the importance of your engagement.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys both so much. That was really illuminating. So we're going to shift topics a little bit to diversity in clinical trials. So it's proven to be scientific and moral imperative, not just a nice to have diversity in clinical trials. It leads to stronger data, safer treatments, and broader applicability. But for too long, underrepresented communities have been excluded, resulting in gaps in safety, efficacy, and trust. The exclusion isn't accidental. It's rooted in systemic barriers, historical mistrust. So the question isn't, should we prioritize diversity? It's how we should do so. So we're going to hear from Val T about this. I'd love to ask you, how do we ensure meaningful representation in clinical trials without turning diversity into a check the box activity?
Yeah, that is a $1 million question. And that is what I do. I do a lot of work in educating communities about clinical research. And I see firsthand how there are questions, there are concerns, the barriers that people face. Many people don't understand what clinical trials are. They don't understand how they work or why participation matters for that. I hear people, they worry about language barriers. They worry about travel. They worry about whether the system is going to respect their experience and their culture, their cultural beliefs that people have. So part of what I do is work to educate people to understand their role in creating change. This is where it starts, how participating in clinical research can shape the different treatments. It can improve care, as we've just heard Michael share. And it also makes the system more inclusive for everyone, including those for future generations. You know, we don't think about the people that's going to come behind us and what effect that might have. So I educate people on those roles, but to really understand what diversity is and why it matters in clinical trials, I think we have to start by looking at everything that may be missing. It's not about race and gender. It also is about age. It's about geography, socioeconomic status, disability, people with different lived experiences. And representation has to reflect that full spectrum of, you know, who the drug is meant to serve. And right now, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And the consequences of that is quite real, as we can see. Treatments are less effective, side effects aren't fully understood. Um, Patients from underrepresented communities could potentially miss out on some life-saving care. Now, you can look at the screen. There's some statistics that you're probably seeing on your screen. Um, you know, we see the barriers, and this is a reality. A lot of times we look at Black patients are 13% of the US population, yet they only make up 5% of the trial participants. Black women in oncology make up just 2% compared to the 84% of white women. We're also seeing that Hispanic communities represent about 19% of the population. The trial enrollment often falls below 1%. Think about that, 1%. And we're also seeing that people with disabilities, they make up 16% of the global population, yet nearly half of those trials exclude people with disabilities. Um, and most rural patients have never been asked about a clinical trial, never heard about it from their providers. And we've got to do better. You know, I think we see a lot of diversity becoming a checkbox.
Yeah.
You know, just, hey, let's check it off. Yes, we got this, we got that. But we can't miss the moment. You know, these are moments that we can build trust. We can generate some meaningful data, you know, real world data. And we can also ensure that trials are, you know, trial design it truly serves all patients.
Yeah.
Somebody commented earlier about that relationship with the researcher, and I think relationship partnership is the key. It's so important. And I think one way that we can make a real difference, you know, is when researchers really step out of that lab and step into the communities they aim to serve. Um, I've seen this firsthand, you know, what it looks like to work. I've done some work as a community scientist, um, partnering with patient advocates, listening to their experiences, and helping kind of co-design trials that are not only accessible, but inclusive, the ones that are grounded in those realities that people face every day.
Yeah. Yeah, this won't surprise you, Valerie, but in my early years in this industry, I mean, it really was the scientists, you know, in their lab figuring all this stuff out. And then we've really advanced more toward early engagement with the population, you know, that would benefit from whatever drug candidate is actually being developed. But that's even been a change in my lifetime, in my career. And so to see kind of your advocacy and the importance of it with respect to diversity, I mean, like it used to be all drugs were tested on men, you know, and then they would be given to women, you know, and none were tested on children. That makes no sense. But I do want to ask you how you feel about, you would recognize, of course, that there are certain drug states. Let's take cystic fibrosis, for example, which affects almost all North American, frankly, white individuals. So you're not advocating diversity for diversity's sake. I mean, in that case, it would make very little sense to have a broad African-American population because the disease doesn't impact them as much, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to say, it's just, you're really talking about, I mean, diversity is critical, but really focusing on the patient population that needs to be studied for a particular disease.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes the conversation, we get stuck on the race, or we get stuck on, you
Yeah,
know, the sex of it. And it's so much broader than that.
yeah,
And Michael is a perfect example. He's a young man that's experiencing a clinical trial. And oftentimes it's still that reality. People think of a clinical trial as a last resort,
yeah,
and not as something that can be used, in earlier lines of treatment, or even upfront in treatment. And I
yeah,
think that's where we have to take a look at things, and start including everyone.
yeah,
That the cultural component of it cannot be ignored either.
yeah,
We think about the past medical mistrust and those things that have happened there. We have to address those. And I think it comes with, educating the community about systems in place to protect.
yeah.
So things like what has happened in the past won't happen again.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Years and years ago, there was a CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, initiative to make sure that drugs that had been approved for use also were tested on people of Medicare eligibility age. And that was like a big, how are we going to handle that? But it was really, I think, a good reminder that, yeah, we need to be testing the folks that would be the biggest, beneficiaries of the medicine. So thank you very much. I think your work is just a tremendous value, and you can be really helpful to sponsors in terms of appreciating the importance of diversity in their trials. I want to move on now to really balancing the FDA's role. And again, many of you know this intuitively or know this factually, but I'll just say that, it's the FDA. The FDA's role is to actually assess and assure the safety of the public health, right? And to assure that medicines that are proven safe and effective come to market. They're also through various rules, really only to make sure that they're approving things that are iteratively better than, or at least not worse than. So we have improvements and innovations actually coming to market. Again, easier said than done. So that's a constant weighing of the risk and benefit, which goes to kind of Michael's point about informed consent. You really need to understand what the risks are before you're getting into a trial. But the FDA really needs to also weigh, are we putting patients, is the benefit that we could be actually securing greater than the risk to which we may be subjecting the patient? Drugs can't be tested for a lifetime. They can only be tested for a period of time if we actually want to get them out to the market to patients. So it's this really, those principles, I think, should remain resolute. What we really need to do when I think of actually kind of trying to move the agency forward is to provide them with flexibility in their tools to actually not have one size fits all rules, have very strong principles, safe and effective. The bar for what is safe, the bar for what is effective is not reduced, but how a company can actually prove safety and efficacy may need to be adjusted based on the size of the patient population, the type of the disease that's being studied, just all the differences. Obviously, diseases are not monolithic. Drug solutions are not monolithic. So we need an agency that is given the authority to basically impose common sense and good judgment when it comes to clinical trials. I think, yeah. And Ashley, I think you wanted to speak a little bit to that.
I just wanted to pipe in. I love what you said, Heidi. Yes, we want to be safe, but I think that we do need just like a little bit of flexibility. I don't think standards, should be lowered, but if we are not more flexible, nothing is ever going to get approved, and it might end up being like too late because of a technicality.
Yep.
It's like the risk versus benefit.
Yep.
I think that should be informed by patients, by real life humans, not just arbitrarily, as you were saying, like the scientist in the lab or the FDA reviewers. I'm just going to share a quick story. My husband, he was not approved for a clinical trial because it was a minor detail in his blood work. I'm sure from the side of the facilitator of the trial, they were worried it would have affected the outcome poorly. But from our side at that point, he was actually, I know we were saying it's not a Hail Mary, but at this point we were out of options. There were no more chemo options or drug options. So he didn't qualify for the trial because of a technicality. And he went into hospice, and 2 weeks later he passed away. And I'm not going to say the trial could have changed that, but it was hope.
Yeah.
And we, it was a chance that we were really counting on. And then with Michael, on the other side, he's in a trial that they have had so much more flexibility, as he shared, because as he said, he had to miss 3 weeks of treatment at one point, but it was written in to the trial that there was some flexibility. So he wasn't disqualified. I remember being terrified, like going back and forth with the doctor. I'm like, is he going to be disqualified from the trial because of this surgery? But they had this window of flexibility written in. And I think that was so wise on, the side of the trial team.
Well, and that, just so you know, that also had to be agreed to by the FDA, right?
Right.
And so again, it's the partnership between all of us. And so, your husband's unfortunate experience could have also been driven by the FDA having no leeway to say his poor outcome, couldn't be considered an outlier. So to me, there is just example after example after example. The more we communicate and the more that there's a partnership between all three parties, the more success we're going to have. And frankly, the more realistic view of the drug when it gets to the commercial marketplace, how it's going to perform. And as you know, we still do follow-up studies and that sort of thing. But I'm so pleased, Michael, that your advocacy has resulted in just tremendous flexibility for you, but also understanding for the sponsor about the challenges. And then also understanding from the FDA that just because he has got to miss 3 weeks doesn't mean he shouldn't still be in the trial and that the results shouldn't be counted. So thank you very, very
That's
much.
my doctor for that. My doctor is the one running the trial, and he's done a great job with that.
That's great. Well, doctors want it to succeed too, right? We are all in this together. At times it can feel contentious, and it shouldn't. And Amy is always quick to remind me that transparency is the absolute antidote to, kind of suspicion and resentment. So the more that we're open and transparent, the better off all parties are, and the better our outcomes.
But I was just going to mention, Amy, because that slide with the patient in the middle, that's really how it has been for us in this trial. So it's been amazing.
Yeah.
Well, moving things along, I wanted to kick it back to Victoria.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you, Michael and Ashley, so much for sharing your experience. So we're gonna shift to talking about modernization. I know we've touched on it a little bit throughout this. There's some chatter about Clinical Trial Modernization Act in the chat. But I want to hear from everyone that we have on this webinar. What does modernization mean to you, and what's at stake if it goes wrong? So let's start out with Heidi first, and we'll hear from everyone. So
back to me, the hog. I'm hogging the time. I think this is a really interesting question about modernization. And, I guess what I want to say is that from my perspective, we are in a constant state of modernization. Right? I do not believe there's ever going to be a day where there will be a pronouncement. The FDA has been thus modified, right? Science is going at a clip that the government can never, meet, right? So we have scientific advancements so quickly, and the government is always playing catch up from behind. So the fact that we have very illustrative examples of FDA modernization, in the past, starting with PDUFA and providing accelerated pathways and other ideas of ways to get products to market quicker are super helpful. But I just think it's an interesting concept, modernization, or when will healthcare reform be done? Never, because we're just hopefully always responding to new things we're learning and new needs. So this slide right here shows you kind of the constant state of evolution within the FDA. And these are things that have been pushed by patient organizations as well as the industry, things that trial and error have made us learn this will make things go better. And the agency and the Congress have been actually pretty responsive. But when I think about future opportunities for continued engagement and the opportunities we have to kind of continue to advance, continue to involve, we've listed some things here that No Patient Left Behind is really focused on advocating. I won't read them all to you, but they really go a lot to, again, the patient-centered development of clinical trials, improved communication amongst all three parties. It can be kind of difficult to get into the FDA at times, and I know that there are patient listening sessions where you can go, but it needs to be more than a check the box. It needs to be a conversation and a partnership. We have, we need enhanced, cross division collaboration and communication. Sometimes a drug is sent to one division versus another, not always for the best reasons. So we've got expertise all over the agency. Let's do that. Leveraging artificial intelligence in some of this, that can really help speed up timelines in terms of reviewing the massive information that sponsors have to submit. But my point is simply, this is we can have this conversation next year, and it'll be a new set of things that we want to continue to actually modernize. So I think we should just look at this as an ongoing continuum of improvement based on where science takes us.
Awesome. Thanks, Heidi. We're going to hear next from Amy C. And also, I just want to put out to the panelists, like asking about modernization, but also if there's one thing you could change to make trials more modern, inclusive, accessible to your community, what would it be? Another thing to think about. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, I'll get started. So mine would be commitment to transparency. So sickle cell patients show up time and time again, but when a drug gets pulled and no one gets an explanation, trust is essentially broken. We do deserve answers, not silence, and patient-centered means showing up even when it's difficult news to deliver. So we're not hard to reach, and we're just tired of being ignored. So the relationship doesn't just end when the trial ends or the drug is approved, it's ongoing.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. Val, love to hear from you, your perspective.
Yeah, so I piggyback on what Amy said. It's that relationship. You have to focus on that relationship. But when I think of modernization and clinical research, I don't automatically think of technology and faster trials. To me, modernization is about people, is about meeting them where they're at. And I think to achieve those diverse enrollments that we're looking for, I think it begins with fostering diverse community relationships. That's the key. Before, during, and after when you're thinking about clinical research. And that could look like showing up in places where trust is already there. Trust has already been established. And it's going to look different for every patient population. Just for example, partnering with some of the churches or faith-based organizations, local community barbershops, those things may work in the African American communities, but it wouldn't work in, say, Hispanic community. I say, when we think of the inclusivity, engaging, like we think of the Native American patients, we think of engaging those tribal counselors and health programs for that subset of population. I think also get, when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community, we have to look in affirming spaces for those individuals and ensuring that accessibility for people with disabilities, that we are connecting with those individuals right where they are. Designing trials that are flexible for older and younger individuals. And very importantly is bringing clinical research to rural clinics and community centers for those patients that are isolated. They're not being at a teaching facility. They don't live near those major cities.
Yes.
So I think just meeting them right where they're at and understanding that you can get into the community Don't try to go it alone. Utilize those trusted partners that are already there. I think that'll get us much further along in the process there. And again, it goes back to removing those check boxes. Get rid of the check boxes and go to building relationships. That's what it's all about. And I know it's a little difficult when we think of AI and everything that's going on and how things are shifting there, but I still think it's about building those relationships.
Those are great points. Thanks so much, Val. And now we'd love to hear from Ashley and then Michael.
Val, I love what you said because I think that's so true. And I guess this kind of goes along with it, but making trials like more accessible as well, like easier to find. I know you're talking about being in the community. In our case, as we were saying, our doctor, he knew about the trial. He's part of the trial, but in general, I think better visibility, like easier visibility. And sometimes it's not just, I know you're talking about the community, Val, but like sometimes it's not just the clinicians that need to be informed, but for patients and caregivers searching on their own, I think it would be great if it were less like detective work, because there's like this assumption, I feel like as soon as you're diagnosed with something, that all of a sudden the patient and the caregivers have all the time in the world to be in the hospital and in all the appointments and for research or whatever it is. And of course, there's people that love Dr. Google and, being online and AI, but it's true with Michael. We had his doctor helping and guiding us. And I think that was like so lucky. And it was also like, in a way, it was lucky because his disease, it's more rare. So it made finding the information easier because it was more limited. With my husband, it was more challenging because he had a more common cancer. Sifting through the options was like totally overwhelming. And his doctor was not really involved. So you're talking about the community, and I'm saying also doctors. I had 3 young kids out, at home at that time. I was working full-time caregiving mom. I needed better advice myself and more help. I needed more direction.
That's great.
And
Yeah.
And I know Michael wants to add on to all of this.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you just said. I think it's really important, flexibility and accessibility for trials. Also, designing for real life. I think modern trials need to stop assuming we're either super sick or superhuman. I'm a cancer survivor, but I still hate the large needles they poke me with. But I still like to surf. Like yesterday, I was surfing. I still hit the gym. And protocols shouldn't ignore the full spectrum of how we live as human patients.
Yeah.
They should accommodate to us. And my doctor, who is running the trial I'm currently a part of, made these certain rules that would allow me to be in the trial. And because of those rules, I did miss a few treatments because of the foot surgery. And that caused me to miss a few weeks. I was so worried I would be kicked out of the trial and not get the treatment I needed and have to battle with the insurance again. But thanks to the way it has been designed, that flexibility allowed me to miss some treatments here and there in case of an emergency that did happen. So I'm very grateful.
Love that. That's a great example of modernization, of at least evolution.
And involvement.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Thanks so much, everyone, for sharing. We appreciate it. And I think we're going to go to Peter now for.
Yeah. So first of all, this is an awesome discussion and so great, not only learning, but also hearing the policy side of this, but also the real patient human side and the in practice side of all these issues. And so, I do want to mention, we do have the reauthorization of the user fee acts underway. And everybody's voice matters, in particular, patient voices matter. And the more that we can work as a community to provide guidance and feedback to regulators, to plans, the drug companies who do clinical trials, the better. And so we would just encourage you to join the movement to modernize the drug development process. You can learn more about how to join a clinical trial at clinicaltrials.gov, where not only what's available, but also taking the time to figure out what's best for you, not just what's going on in your disease state. Definitely speak up in your settings and your communities. I mean, the reality is that the drug companies actually benefit a lot more than you think from your feedback, because the more that they can understand not only if the medicine works, but how best to deliver it to patients. That actually helps everyone, including the company itself. So it's very important to speak up, both whether you're participating in a clinical trial or if you're trying to shape the policy environment. And then lastly, just encourage you to stay involved, stay in the know. We follow us on social media, become an NPLB first responder, because as you get towards some of the changes at FDA, both regulatory, legislative, or the reauthorization of the User Fee Act, we definitely want to try and make sure that you're informed and how can help us find this balance of using new technologies to speed up the drug discovery process and make it less costly for everyone. So thank you. And then lastly, make sure if you have additional stories to tell, in addition to what we've heard here today, please share it with us because we do collect them and share them as well. So thank you. And with that, Victoria, any questions out there?
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? I know there's been a few put in the chat, but now's the time that Peter's answered. I don't know if we want to kind of discuss those more, if anyone has new ones.
Just to highlight, the importance of how everybody wins when clinical trials are sped up in a responsible way, whether it's using technology to reshore some clinical trials that are currently taking place in Europe but don't take place in the US because of trial design, whether it's compensating patients more appropriately, not just for their time but their overall care costs, or using these new technologies like AI to reduce the number of placebos in a trial, all these things that can have a meaningful impact where you're not only benefiting patients and speeding safe and effective drugs to the market sooner, but that has that consequence of also lowering the drug development costs for the company. Paying patients more actually improves their retention and reduces the amount of time it takes to get approved, which means the overall burn rate of the company is actually reduced. And then from a regulatory perspective, the sooner that you can bring new safe and effective drugs to market, the more that you're reducing those acute care costs that medicines are so great at developing. And then, of course, the quality of all of our lives, because we like to say no patient left behind, that we're all patients at one point in our lives. So I just wanted to really hit home on the point of improving that and modernizing the clinical trial process is exceptionally important to all of us, whether you are sick today or maybe in the future or a taxpayer.
Awesome. Well, I think we're all out of time now. I want to thank all of our panelists for being on this webinar, sharing their insights, super helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Victoria.